So we're excited to have you here today. The agenda for today's event will include some welcomes and introductions. We'll hear about a brief overview from our panelists about their federal funding experiences. Then we'll move into a fireside chat where our panelists will share some answers to some questions that we have. And then we'll open it up to all of you for an audience Q&A. So if you have questions throughout today's event, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will get to them at that time. Today's webinar is hosted by Emerald Cities Collaborative, the Climate and Clean Energy Equity Fund, and Just Solutions. So a little bit about each of these organizations. Emerald Cities Collaborative pursues high road approach to greening our cities, building resilient regional economies, and strengthening our democracy. By building cross-sector collaborations acutely focused on those historically left out of the economic and community development process, ECC helps communities unleash their capacity to build high road economies that are more sustainable, economically just, and democratic. The Equity Fund's goal is to support and uplift community-based organizations representing communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change and the health, environmental, and economic injustices of the fossil fuel economy, to also advance bold actions that address climate change and accelerate the transition to a just and equitable clean energy future in 13 states. And lastly, Just Solutions is a BIPOC-led national climate organization that partners with communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate change to turn their priorities and ideas into policies and laws. And as I said, if you're on the call with us today, please feel free to add your name, your organization, and where you're located in the chat so everyone else can know where else we all are calling in from. So the purpose of today's webinar is to explore the intricacies of the federal grant application process, the challenges that are associated with being a federal grantee, and understand how federal funding can be utilized to advance climate and environmental justice. We will start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves, their organizations, and share a brief background on their relationship with federal funding. And yeah, we'll go from there. So I will pass it over to Bob to get us started.
Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Dean. I'm the Chief Strategy and Program Officer at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. We're a nonprofit organization based in Chicago, but working across the country, about 20 people strong. We work on topics including environmental justice, climate change, housing affordability, and transportation equity. So all places where equity and sustainability come together in the built environment of cities. And that's really our focus. We have two things we're known for. One of those is analytics. We produce web tools and we do advanced analysis. And we're also known for working in close partnership with community-based organizations. And a lot of our work on the federal side is actually about that. CBO support. So I'm going to use the word CBO a lot, which to us stands for community-based organization, not Congressional Budget Office. So when I say that, that's what I mean. We really mean nonprofit, like frontline community organizations that typically serve the neighborhood scale. So that's who C&T is. We've had experience using federal funding for many years now, but we recently ramped up quite a bit. We have 3 examples of using funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. One is installing green stormwater infrastructure in heavily flooded areas in the Chicago suburbs, which is a $6 million project. We have one supporting equitable transit-oriented development in the city of Chicago, which is really around providing technical assistance to community-based real estate developers in moving projects along which are close to transit. And we have another project installing energy efficiency and other green improvements in affordable housing in a community outside Chicago with an emphasis on preserving affordability. We also have an upcoming project with the Department of Energy to build CBO capacity to deal with vehicle electrification, which is a growing interest and a lot of resources and money put into it. And we want to empower community organizations to know what's happening so they can respond to those opportunities and challenges when they come up. Each of those is about $1 million in size in terms of the value of the federal money coming through. And a smaller one, but one of my favorites, is simply meant to improve CBO engagement in the operations of the Regional Planning Agency in Chicago. For that one, it's not implementation focused, but it's benefited from a really thoughtful approach by the regional agency, and that's probably because they're not in a huge hurry to spend ARPA money, which has a very strict timeline associated with it. So it can take a little longer to do it carefully. So all of these are different. I just went through them to give you a sense of the like variety and range of federally funded projects that we're working on, but each have some shared features. Each of them is highly relevant to our mission, which again is about equity and sustainability in the built environment of cities. And the topics vary. I mean, as I mentioned, it's green infrastructure, affordable housing, vehicle electrification, commercial real estate development, but all of these tie back to that central mission. And each also includes substantial funding being passed through to community-based organizations. So each implements our mission in two ways. One is we're doing something which is topically very mission aligned, but then second, we're very purposely and deliberately involving CBOs as recipients of this federal funding. And another thing they have in common is that they really strain our resources. So for most of these projects, we've been able to secure a complementary philanthropic grant to allow us to do some things on the side that are hard to use federal money for, which allows more workable relationships with CBOs and individual participants. We can cover meeting expenses. We can cover other expenses that are hard to cover federally. So through this, we're accomplishing our priorities. But I mean, what we observe overall is that our strategies to accomplish these projects and do what we're supposed to do, honestly, like all kind of feel like workarounds. We've had to be very like intentionally creative in finding roles for CBOs and getting them compensated. It's still not a normal thing to do. It takes tremendous effort every time we do it. And sometimes, as I mentioned, it has to include separate philanthropic fundraising that we've had to do on the side. So it's somewhat awkward, like on both sides. The government systems just don't seem to be set up to get us the money and our CBO partners the money in a way that makes sense to us and is most usable by us. So for us, I mean, my kind of closing point here is our goal is the routine matter of course involvement of community organizations in infrastructure investment decisions. But even though we're working toward that, I feel like we're still very far from that goal today. So I'll pass this off to the next person.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that overview. Sissy, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Sissy Trin. I am the Executive Director of SICA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance. We're a neighborhood-based organization in Chinatown, Los Angeles, that does youth and community organizing around equitable development, affordable housing, and homelessness prevention. In March of 2020, overnight almost, we ended up becoming a COVID relief organization, largely because what we were seeing was that our city and county were not doing outreach and education to limited English proficient residents in our communities and those with tech barriers. They were over-relying on internet outreach strategies and then predominantly focusing on English and to a lesser extent Spanish, but didn't even translate documents into Chinese. And so started doing a lot of work doing education, outreach, PPE distribution, and at one point, we even ran a vaccine clinic and provide rental assistance. So basically our experience has been a lot of like direct service work around COVID and COVID recovery, but then also separately started doing advocacy and organizing in late 2020, specifically around CARES and ARPA funds, since they were block grants, to utilize as an opportunity to fund an affordable housing land bank in LA County. So we have both experience as a direct service provider and then also as an organization that does advocacy and organizing on the local expenditure of these funds.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that intro. And next, we will pass it over to Franchelle.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Franchelle Parker. I'm the Executive Director of Open Buffalo. We are a non-for-profit organization. We operate in Western New York. We just bring together everyday people in order to learn new skills, to connect with other community activists and grassroots organizations so that they can become leaders in the fight against racism and poverty and climate change throughout Western New York. Buffalo has a very complicated relationship with race and the environment. Therefore, when Open Buffalo was established, it was critically important for us to operate at the intersection of both. Since our founding in 2014, we've had the absolute honor to serve as an anchor organization to help re-grant resources to dozens of grassroots organizations seeking to implement just transition strategies in their community. Currently, we are working on a project, a $10 million project funded through NYSERDA to bring clean mobility options to the east side of Buffalo. The east side of Buffalo is where approximately 85% of Black people reside. We live in a hyper segregated city to be a city of our size. We're also looking to replace over 60,000 lead service water lines that go directly into the homes, again, predominantly in Black communities. And so we work to build the power. Some of what we'll talk about today is establishing an urban ecology center in order to, again, operate at the intersection of race and climate.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then we'll hear from Stacy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Grant, she, her pronouns. I'm a community collaborator with Path Consulting. I'm located here in the Anishinaabe lands, Dearborn, Michigan, right outside of Detroit. And I partner directly with small grassroots nonprofit organizations and coalitions in Michigan and really across the country to advance what I know is our shared mission to not just resource, but abundantly resource community solutions and to really ensure that there's tangible, lasting benefits surrounding Justice 40 implementation and this historic moment we're in of climate and environmental justice funding that organizers have been fighting for decades. And this money and this funding and these resources are going to be flowing over the next 7 to 9 years. And so we have an opportunity. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation. I recently transitioned from my role as a program navigator with the Justice 40 Accelerator. So the Accelerator is a collaborative program that serves, when I was there, 101, but now 150 climate and environmental justice organizations to really do this work, which is demystifying this very complex process of federal funding and to really provide the direct support and technical assistance to ensure that communities have the self-determination to decide whether or not federal funding is the right course of resourcing their projects. And I've had the honor of working with both Bob as a TA partner and Fran Chell, who was with Open Buffalo, a cohort member with the Accelerator. And I'm grateful to be here with you, Sissy, and all of you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you all for sharing that context with us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are going to dive into our fireside chat. As we mentioned, if anyone has any questions throughout today's presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box so we can ensure that we get to them during the audience Q&A portion. So the first question that we have is, what has been the biggest challenge in navigating funding from the federal government? So I will start with you, Bob. Can you answer this question?
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. I'm going to talk about money that is federal in origin, whether or not it comes directly from the federal government. We do a lot of work on infrastructure investment on the transportation side and other programs like that. And lots of federal funding passes through local and state governments first. So the federal government is obviously important as a direct funder when it comes to their discretionary programs. But one just thing to keep in mind with a lot of what we were talking about is not to forget kind of statutory program funds, which are actually larger than the discretionary funds that get advertised by the federal government. Almost all of these go through states or other forms of government, but they are federal in origin. So for us, this question is as much about how to get state and local governments to be more equity-centric in their decision-making about how the money that they have authority over gets put out. And there are honestly just all kinds of barriers that prevent this from happening. We've done with some partners some research on this and classified them into cultural, structural, and bureaucratic barriers that are kind of that the gap between government and community organizations. And so this ranges from the big picture, like, is community participation even valued at the government you're trying to work with, or is there an oppositional relationship, to the boring items like procurement or contracting requirements. And what we find is in many places, these boring details are often what hold it up. There are good ideas among the program staff, like whether these are Department of Transportation staff or people in the like sustainability office. And there are good ideas that originate there, but then those hit the kind of legal or procurement office buzzsaw, and all of those good intentions just get lost. And there are lots of reasons this connection does not work out for many organizations. There's questions like, do you have a federally approved indirect rate that you can immediately start charging? Do you have sufficient insurance coverage to hit what requirements are there? Do you track staff time and payroll in the right way to even be able to submit invoices that will be accepted? Do you have a finance team that's able to submit invoices on a schedule that the government wants to see? Are you willing to sign a contract with 40 pages of indecipherable terms and conditions that you need to do before you can get access to any of this? And in most cases, almost all cases, I think the nonprofits do not qualify as disadvantaged business enterprises. So we will never count as MBEs or WBEs, no matter what our leadership looks like. And so rules that are meant to provide procurement benefits to those types of private firms do not currently apply really at all to nonprofits. And all of these are present at local and state government. But what we found is there's also a federal barrier. Many local governments have done CBO compensation with their own money, but they won't use federal money for it because essentially they're risk averse and are concerned that they're going to violate some federal rule. And so even if they're comfortable using their own money for these mission-driven activities, there's this just inherent caution that prevents them from using federal money, which is often one of the largest chunk for things that really would go to CBOs. So what we've kind of observed is the federal government has been very good at saying that you can compensate CBOs with federal money, but less good at creating new rules that actually allow that to happen. I think that their language and the actual regulations are kind of a step out of date. And one thing I'm going to drop in the chat here, actually, there's a set of new rules that have just come out recently from the Office of Management and Budget about federal procurement requirements, which are 473 pages in length, and I have no ability to read them. So if anyone here knows anyone who has tried to read and decipher this, I would actually love to know, because I've been asking everybody, and nobody so far has actually read this very important document. You really need to be a lawyer or procurement expert to do it. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. But those are really some of the barriers that I think we've observed in the world that make this so challenging.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that in the chat as well. And Sissy, do you have any thoughts on what has been your biggest challenge in navigating this?
I would echo a lot of what Bob has said. I think that in our experience, a lot of these systems are really designed for large corporations and nonprofits who are contractors, right? Like the national organizations with, like, 8-digit or 8-figure budgets, as opposed to small grassroots organizations where we're reaching like the most vulnerable, the least connected communities, right? And so oftentimes things like overhead seem really annoying and bureaucratic. And oftentimes when government thinks of overhead, they think of like, ridiculous executive compensation, when, for example, we are a recipient of essentially FEMA dollars. It's kind of funneled through, an intermediary, but we do emergency rental assistance. And the grant doesn't pay for stamps to mail rent checks out to, right? Like little things like that are overhead. And so we have to spend a lot of time explaining to our foundation and philanthropic partners why overhead is important, because it's not about like paying for like fancy vacations for me. It's literally, can we pay for stamps? And other kind of like things that oftentimes you don't think about in terms of like overhead rates, right? And then of course, comparing how much, NIH pays overhead rates for Harvard University or USC, for example, as much as like 80%. And somehow that's justifiable. And I think part of that is the conversation around creating different standards for smaller nonprofits versus like the large entities, right? I think that it's really important to kind of make those distinctions, and oftentimes federal and local, government agencies that are managing the federal dollars don't make those distinctions. And so oftentimes they, when we say that we don't have the money to pay $500,000 for insurance coverage, like we were a grantee of, I think it was like CARES Act money at one point, and basically they wanted us to have a level of insurance coverage that would have eaten up 90% of the budget. Right. And so I think a lot of what we've done is partner with intermediary organizations that can act as the fiscal receiver to help us navigate these processes and help us navigate the reporting requirements, right? Like, we're collecting all this information about all the work we're doing. We're just not doing it in the very specific and not necessarily useful way that these government agencies want us to do. And so part of it is working with the intermediaries to help do some of that translation.
Yeah, totally. Thank you for sharing that. And Franchelle, given your experience receiving state funding, can you speak to the challenges you face there?
Yeah, I would suggest that everyone develops a mantra in order to get you through this process. It is stressful. Just breathe in, our work matters, exhale. Why don't government agencies talk to each other, right? And many times grassroots organizations are put in the middle of helping other agencies communicate with each other. In response to a racial massacre that happened next door to our office at Tops Supermarket, the governor's office offered additional resources to grassroots organizations that were playing some role in rapid response. And that happened May 14th of last year, and we are still in the process of trying to draw down those resources. For many of our grassroots organizations, we don't have HR directors. We don't have administrative directors. The ED wears multiple hats. If you're lucky enough to have a deputy director, both of you all wear multiple hats, right? So, how do you balance program work with all of the very intense requirements of government agencies? Right now, we are hiring for a full-time administrative director, but someone, many times, the folks that do justice-related work, environmental, climate change work, they want to do that work. They don't want to learn about indirect rates. They don't want to process OMB circulars. But those are, especially for our BIPOC organizations, that administrative and financial oversight capacity is something that desperately needs to be invested in. When we're talking to our funders, again, as Sissy said, we need those unrestricted dollars. Many times we have the best ideas in regards to how programs should be implemented. We put in a budget and a program for $1 million, and $500,000 gets funded. So where does all of that other money come from? We still have the same level of deliverables that they're expecting from us, right? And so I think that needs to be the call, that we're not asking for slush funds to go on vacations, but simply being able to buy a gift card for our youth that are coming, right? Those are all barriers, especially when so much time goes into our grant applications, and then to have to simultaneously do additional fundraising on top of that, specifically to supplement the program. We are, that was one particular, and then also through the NYSERDA Clean Mobility work, we are a sub-recipient of that funding. However, we can't necessarily wait to be reimbursed for 8 months. So really ensuring that we have, by by the grace of God, we were able to hang on until the reimbursements come. But for many of us, we have to look at what is our cash flow? What is our cash flow? Even if a decision is made in January, many times we will not receive funding until September, or maybe even the other year. So what is our cash flow? And really making sure that we're crunching the numbers, not just on the strategy, but the financial piece. And if folks don't have that, many times funders are willing to look at collaborative strategies with other small non-for-profits in order to help us build out the infrastructure in order to receive those dollars. But those have been two huge challenges for us. We're thankful for the resources, but they do come with their own separate set of challenges.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And this next question, is a great response to this. How can organizations really prepare to be a recipient of these dollars? And so I'll pass this to you, Stacy. Since you provide a lot of support to organizations, do you have any recommendations on what organizations can do to better prepare to receive federal funding?
I think that Franchel's advice to take a deep breath is a good one. We can hear the word or think about federal funding, and it elicits a lot of, it can elicit a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings. It can be suspicious, intimidating, overwhelming, curious, and also hopeful. And that's really where we can hold all of those things. And so having a framework to understand this historic moment of federal funding, and a lot of the funding is going to be flowing through your states. And so when we talk about federal funding, we can just talk generally about public funding. Um, Having a framework is really helpful, but just remembering that we know that winning federal funding or public funding is not our North Star. Resourcing your worthy projects and advancing your community vision, that's the North Star. And so we need to rest in that. We need to remind each other of that along this way. But with that said, we can think about federal funding as being a learning journey, and some are farther ahead. But wherever you're at, it's just the right moment. And there is a community that is really, surrounding, and kind of swarming this moment to support. So as a journey, we can think about sort of 4 stations of readiness that, and this is just something that helps me in terms of kind of visualizing, okay, I'm a small nonprofit organization. I've never applied for federal funding before. How can I think about this and organize a plan? And so the readiness is really a spectrum. It's a gradient. So we're talking about organizational capacity and readiness, your project readiness, your application readiness. So, do you know where to find grants? Do you know how to read the notice of funding announcement? Look through and sift through all of the eligibility requirements, the registrations, and fit. So is this grant actually a fit and aligned to the work that we want to do, not trying to align the work that you're doing to meet the grant? And then the last part, because we talk about applying for grants, but there's a whole separate component of grants that we're really hoping that philanthropy and federal agencies and state agencies will really help communities to support. And that's the actual grant management and implementation, all of the reporting and compliance, and what it really takes, kind of as Franchelle talked about, to manage the award and then be on a reimbursable payment schedule that is really not feasible for a lot of organizations. I know that the state of California has really been a pioneer in looking at this issue of reimbursable payment, and that lag of time, and really doing kind of that upfront payment that communities need for some of the state funding. So I hope that model is spread across states, and I hope that the federal agencies and federal government also take a look at that, because it's going to be a continuous practical barrier to really receiving federal funding. But the last thing I would just offer is that to prepare for what we're going to need along this journey is to seek out that trusted person. You know, this is relational work. It can be one-on-one. And so finding, you know, Bob and CNT in Chicago is just an incredible resource of that support. They have federal grant experience. They can provide, you know, sub grants and can really help organizations in their communities navigate this complex process. And so if you don't have that kind of individual person or those trusted local partners to help you navigate, I know that we're going to have the chance to dive into some of the technical assistance programs and providers that are doing that right now.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that, Stacy. So let's talk about the application and reporting requirements. I'll start with you, Bob. Can you share if the application and reporting requirements, are they burdensome? Do you receive assistance? Was it hard to navigate?
Yeah, I mean, we have a little bit of a unique role in how we approach this because we both act as a federal grantee ourselves, and we also act as kind of a fiscal agent. I mean, we wouldn't really call it that, but we do get money and then pass it through to smaller organizations. And even for us as like a mid-sized nonprofit, I mean, we're 20 staff and we don't consider ourselves to be a frontline group. We still find that a lot of times the application requirements are impossible for us. It's just it's too much to go through the government requirements. So we often act as a sub consultant to a prime contractor when we go after some of these things and have someone else really lead, whether it's a larger nonprofit or a consulting firm that does this kind of stuff all the time. And then we act as a sub to them. And then often the pass through to community organizations is even a sub below us, because what we've also found is the deeper we make that in the project structure, the more likely it is that we find some degree of flexibility in terms of how those grants can go through. So the prime has the worst like responsibilities, and then it gets progressively easier as you kind of go down the chain. You also lose, though, some control and some connection to the funder of the project, and some loss of control over how it ends up when you're not the chief or the first recipient of the funding yourself. So, but yeah, I mean, our short answer is yes. We have. It was burdensome. We did not receive very much assistance from anybody. We never get that much help going through this, and that is, you know, a problem, particularly for smaller organizations.
Definitely. Thank you. And Sissy, do you have any insights on this question and your experience in applying and reporting?
Yeah, I have a lot of experience. So just as a quick reminder, CARES and ARPA funds were essentially block grants to states and local governments, right? With relatively limited number of restrictions. Local governments and states could add additional requirements on top of that per their whatever guidelines, right? And so LA County has a whole metric around racial equity and targeting the funds for racial equity, which is awesome. When we were negotiating with the county as a subcontractor, actually, for a recipient of CARES Act dollars to do some of our COVID, rapid response work, we were told that it was a block grant, that it was to fund the existing work we were already doing, that they supported us and you could just use it for whatever. And mind you, this was in September of 2020, when the deadline for spend down was December 31st of that year. And so we were like, great, we'll take it, block grants, especially during that time. And then we got a notification 2 weeks later. Actually, so the county wants additional requirements. That's fine. And then we got another request 2 weeks later to add another requirement, and then another one 2 weeks later. And by November, we still hadn't signed any contracts. We still hadn't gotten a clear scope of work. And basically, I had to throw a temper tantrum and say, like, if you guys keep doing this, we're not going to take the money. Like, we don't want the money if you can't figure out how you want us to spend it. And we have to spend it in a month and a half, right? And fundamentally, it's important for people to know, like, sometimes requirements aren't actually requirements. It's just random arbitrary things that some bureaucrat, in this case LA County, decided to add. Maybe sometimes they do it out of, you know, good intentions, but when you have a ticking clock, especially in this case, we had like 6 weeks to spend down this money. You know, like, these kinds of delays mean significant delays in paying our staff, in getting work done, in getting stuff completed, right? And so I think it's really important to kind of have these conversations and have these honest conversations in a way that's, it's not about like, oh, we can't do it because we're a scrappy nonprofit that can't, you know, are not sophisticated. It is, do you want us to spend time actually in the community, or do you want us to spend time writing your reports?
Very real. Thank you for sharing that. And another question for you. What happens if a project changes during the implementation period? Can you speak to your experience with that?
So something that everybody should know is the government bureaucrats will get mad at you. That is 99% the case, that at some point this is going to happen. Now, you as an organization have to decide, is this something they're going to get mad at me, or is this something I have to respond to, or is this just somebody like getting mad for the sake of getting mad, right? And it's an important distinction, because sometimes it's a function of you being a nonprofit that's unresponsive and the funder or the government agency has a valid reason for being mad. And then there are times when they're just mad because they're looking to get mad at somebody for something that has nothing to do with you, right? And so it's an important distinction to make, because then you have to figure out, do I need to respond to this person or not? So sometimes I don't, to be quite honest, because it's clear, like, it's just this one random person looking for a reason to get mad. And then there are times where it's like, okay, I need to have a sit-down conversation with them to kind of explain the circumstances as to why we need to be able to kind of make changes. And sometimes changes are valid, right? Like, for example, when we had originally gotten our CARES and ARPA money to do COVID response work, we were planning on doing this long, extended, you know, public education campaign. This was like early 2021, around vaccines and vaccine safety. All of a sudden, we were given all these doses by the city of LA in, like, I think it was like January or February, and all that education that we were planning to do had to get thrown out the window, because all of a sudden now we're in the distribution business, right? So that's a very clear example of like responding to opportunities, responding to emergencies, and that's why the change happens, right? And so it was a valid reason to kind of switch things up, but you have to be able to let your, you know, contacts in the government, you know, in your philanthropic community know as far in advance as possible why these changes happen, right? And you have to be able to articulate that the changes are strategic, right? Or important, or in response to something that you can't ignore, as opposed to, I just didn't want to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing that. And we are getting a lot of questions from the audience Q&A, so I want to make sure we have time to answer those. So I'm going to start incorporating those questions. So as we mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box, and we'll get to them now. So one of the questions we received was from someone who works for a funder, and they're wondering what should funders be doing to support in order to get their nonprofit ecosystem ready to apply for public funding. Should we be building up our intermediaries, improving reporting and financial management capacity? And this is open for any of you all to answer and share your thoughts.
I can respond. I think they should just be hiring staff to help us find the grants and help us manage the grants. You know, I have a lot of funders who are well-meaning, who offer capacity building trainings. But if my overworked staff are trained to be a little bit more efficient, it doesn't address the fact that my staff are overworked, right? Like, we need additional staffing to do these things, as opposed to funding technical assistance providers who will just provide us with training for an organization that's already understaffed in the first place.
So I'm going to say maybe three things that I think would be good ideas. I agree with everything Sissy just said. I think also unrestricted grants to groups that are trying to get federal funding to allow them to hire the administrative staff they need would be fantastic. Because what we have found is that we lose money whenever we get a federal grant. We just can't get our full indirect and administrative costs paid. And so we lose money. And so we need some place to make that up. The best place to make that up is from a general operating grant, from a foundation. So I think anybody who from the funder side, any CBOs or small nonprofits who are trying to get and manage these federal grants almost certainly could use some unrestricted funding to help to offset those losses. I think that there's a lot of resources out there already for grant writing personally. A lot of places you can get assistance with that. So I feel like the management of the grant is more underfunded than the writing of the grants to get the funding in the first place. So that's my tactical response. My also strategic response is that it would be great if funders could pool together some kind of effort to identify and map all the barriers that we're all facing. Because I mean, we're all facing them, but what we're actually spending our time on is trying to run the grants. And so we don't really have time to document and share all of the experiences that we're having. But I think that collecting these experiences and kind of confronting government with them at some point would be an effective thing to do. So I think also some effort by the funding community to find some way that kind of collection and documentation of these barriers and putting that together in a presentable way would be extremely helpful in the longer term solution to that problem. It does not stop the immediate pain, but I think in the systems change piece of that would be very attractive too.
And I also want to add, I agree with everything that's been said. Unrestricted funding, please. Also, the Community Foundation for Greater Buffalo, I think has an incredible model, which just started with just listening, inviting frontline organizations in for a conversation. Last month, we had an opportunity to speak to their board about the challenges that we're facing specifically in climate and environmental work here in Western New York, and just listen. And from that, we decided that the Community Foundation could take a greater role in grant, not just grant distribution, but convening national funders, playing a greater role in really kind of serving as that intermediary organization as opposed to just a funder. And so that was something that really emerged just from listening. And we know that every community will be different. They will face their own challenges, but that's always step one. Not coming with an agenda and just legitimately listening to what are the challenges that our organizations, specifically our grassroots organizations, what are they facing, and approaching it in that way.
Thank you all for those responses. That was great. And another question that we received during the pre-registration was around how can communities that may be at odds with their state government, their local government politically, really lean in and get access to funding. So this question is around how do you navigate receiving project funding while also advocating for the political issues that your organization does? How does that balance work? So I don't know, Sissy or Stacy, if you have any insights on that one.
I do, but I've been talking a lot. So if Stacy has anything to say,
I would love to hear for sure. Well, I'll just share really quickly that the power that community organizations have right now to leverage federal funding is real, because there are some federal grants, and we can look at federal grants as being they come in different sizes, different packages, different agencies. And so the upcoming EPA community change grants, that requires a CBO to be really in the driver's seat. It can be a partnership between two or more community-based organizations, or it could be a community organization that invites a city or local partner to be a part of the plan. Another one that just to kind of share is the EPA grant maker grants that are going to be rolling out in the spring. That is really an opportunity for communities to apply for grants that are really being managed by these larger grant making entities. And so you don't have to have, a SAM.gov registration. The reporting requirements are going to be simplified. And those grants are tiered, so you can apply for planning grants, really just doing like the community visioning and, project build out. And then it, leads up to kind of the planning and implementation funding that you're going to need onto, evaluation and reporting. And so while this isn't all encompassing of all federal funding, I think really honing in on the opportunities that are at least somewhat designed in a way that is more inviting for communities will be important.
Definitely. Before.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to kind of respond to this too, because I think actually an important question to ask as a nonprofit is whether the taking of public money from your government would reduce your ability to effectively advocate for the things that you want to advocate for, either because you feel like that would prevent you, or because you feel like you would be seen a different way by other people in your community if you were also funded by the government. So I think that's honestly a really important question for people to try to get to, because not every organization might ultimately want to take public funding, because some would prefer to play the kind of fully outside game role. And C&T does both. We do the inside, we do consulting with government, we do the outside for advocacy. And we've been able to make that work as far as being able to say what we think and take public money. But I do think that that's honestly a thing that every organization should very deliberately talk about. Does this reduce our power if we take this? And if the answer is yes, that might just be a trade-off that you're not willing to make.
Totally. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that question? Awesome.
So I think a couple of things for me is we're talking about government like it's one singular monolithic thing, and not really thinking about it as a series of a lot of different agencies. And oftentimes there's a disconnect between the elected officials and what they want versus what the agencies or department staff want. It's important because sometimes you have, if let's say that you have the Department of Health pissed off against you, but you have your local, mayor or supervisor or whoever solidly in your corner supporting you, then there's they can provide a political shield essentially, or vice versa, right? Or maybe you have the Department of Transportation mad at you, but you're working on a grant that's going to HUD, right? Or the housing department. There's like a lot of space in between them. And so sometimes you're lobbying one agency while you're applying for funding from another agency. They don't talk to each other. They don't talk to each other oftentimes when they're working together on an individual project. So I don't think that you should always be assuming that you have to play nice. I think it's a political strategy and a political calculus that you need to kind of think about in terms of the overall scope and scale of the work you want to do as an organization, right? Because we've gotten direct funding from, let's say, the Department of Public Health while lobbying, the budget folks, right, separately. And they don't know that we're doing any of those things because, I don't know, LA County's large. Nobody talks to each other.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. It's very important. And so one question that we got a couple times was kind of around technical assistance. Sorry. So have any of you had experience with technical assistance offered by federal agencies? And what was that experience and what was the TA support like? No technical assistant experience here? Okay, cool. Oh, go ahead, Stacey.
So I'll just jump in really quick that it is a little bit astounding when you start doing some digging to see how much technical assistance is provided by federal agencies. These are technical assistance centers that are set up typically as cooperative agreements, which just means that you have an entity that is receiving taxpayer dollars, and their whole role is to offer technical assistance to local governments, to community nonprofits, um, to small businesses who are needing their support. And so the disconnect really between the support and those who need it, that gap is really a cataloging information gap. This is something that, we've been advocating that philanthropy does have a role. The agencies themselves have a role. It is not the responsibility of communities to try to be mapping and hunting down, website after website, trying to find what they need. We've had some success in connecting to the technical assistance for brownfield providers through the EPA. They're a program, so every region is covered. You can, if you have a brownfield project, wherever you're at in the life cycle, even if you're just trying to locate the brownfields in your community, or you're, looking for saying, what are the health hazards? Is there cleanup money? These technical assistance providers are really there to provide direct support to you for the life cycle of your project. Now navigating that process and making sure that they are attentive and don't, send you a brochure and say, hey, reach back out to us if you have any questions, but really say, like, we want to unlock this partnership because you all have the subject matter expertise. We're the community that's going to be really here doing the work. It's really, us a matter of communities, advocating for this, and then federal, TA providers really centering communities and approaching their work in a much more proactive and equitable way. I would just underscore the technical assistance to the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers that the EPA has stood up. So these are resource centers that you can go to. You can look them up. So they're called Tic Tacs, and they're supposed to be kind of a ground floor, front door to navigating this whole process. We were really happy to see some community-based organizations actually be the lead applicants and really be the hub of these Tic Tacs. So we Act for Environmental Justice in New York, Blacks and Green in Chicago for Region 5, Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, because they both hold a relationship with community organizations, but they are also now providing these resources. I think that there needs to be kind of an accelerated buildup, right? These centers are going to be available and open for 5 years. And so you don't have to kind of scurry today to go, try and get all your answers or get all your questions answered. But we really are going to need to make sure that those Tic Tacs are front and center and that communities are really, able to access the resources that they're offering.
Okay. Can I just add a quick, C&T is part of the Region 5 Tic Tac, the one that is led by Blacks and Green. And honestly, I think we were announced in March. We just got a contract to sign earlier this week. It took that long for Blacks and Green to negotiate a contract with EPA. And honestly, I know Big is ready to go. So I think this is just EPA has been very slow in rolling these things out. We are hoping this really ramps up and becomes very useful. But as of now, I don't think there's many TA requests coming in because it is so early in the stage. So I think there's potential with these, but again, because of just the barriers between the federal government and the lead TA recipients in the cases where they're smaller nonprofits, like the same barriers that we've been talking about the whole day today, also exist between the TA providers and the federal government in the first place. So I think it's the same problem is being reflected again. But I think ultimately it is I agree with Stacey, it's a great opportunity, and we're hoping that it ends up being very useful.
And I also want to add to Stacey's point. Stacy has been such a tremendous resource. I have no idea how she holds all of this information in her mind. But she helped to connect us to the Brownfield TA provider. And just going back that we don't, even as justice organizations, we don't always have to have an adversarial relationship with our government partners. And so we started the conversation, we didn't have a site in mind, but we started doing that relationship building. And just 2 weeks ago, she came and did a fabulous presentation to our Emerging Leaders program. And so now, out of that conversation that we didn't really know where it was going to go at first, but now we have 25 BIPOC grassroots leaders that are going to map potentially 75 brownfields on the east side of Buffalo, right? And so just being open to developing relationships, we hear all the time that the difference between our elected officials and the staffers. So I just want to go back to that point of, and in addition to the TA process, being open to where it can go and what can emerge out of that process, but then also making sure that we're building authentic relationships with staffers at every single level. And, you know, really making sure that we have an inside strategy too, because we've developed those relationships.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Didn't this hour fly by? I can't believe we're at the end. It's crazy. And just thank you all for being so engaged with us throughout this hour and asking your questions. Wish we could stay on forever and dig really deep into this, but I, of course, want to be respectful of all of your time. So I will just have the panelists, if you could say one final takeaway that you'd like folks listening to walk away from this conversation with, what would it be? So we'll just go around. Start with you, Bob.
Okay, I wasn't ready. Good question. I mean, I think that this is what the reason we go after federal money is it helps to accomplish our mission. And so that is what makes us interested. I think that it's just important to realize that this is going to bring administrative challenges and you also might lose money. And so is that worth it to you to do that because it advances your mission enough is one of the calculations that you should be making when considering this.
Thank you. Sissy?
So, yeah, I agree with Bob. It can be a pain in the ass, but it's also, to be quite honest and quite frank, like that's how you scale the work, right? Philanthropy will never be able to solve the major issues because they're not going to invest at the same scale that like government will and should. You know, I think about, for example, a lot of our work around homelessness and homelessness prevention, right? Philanthropy may pay for the pilots, right? The data collection, the analysis, the evaluation, but they're not going to be funding operations and maintenance and capital acquisitions fund and, you know, rehab funds. And so a lot of the work has to have an eye towards how public funds are deployed, whether or not you choose to be a direct recipient, or maybe you work through advocacy and organizing to kind of steer funds in a specific direction or away from a specific direction. I will also say a lot of the infrastructure we're talking about with federal government funding, you know, translates to any funding that you may want to apply for at the state level or at the county level as well, right? And so don't use this webinar to only think about federal funding as the only pipeline to public funds.
Thank you for that. Franchelle?
Don't be intimidated by the process. Seek the help. There's resources in every community. Really do the research, as Bob said, really making that conscious decision. Is this the right opportunity for me? Because it's going to come at a cost, but it is the way that we scale. If we talk about systems change, we need as many resources as possible in order to accomplish our mission. Therefore, these are our public dollars. Let's remember that, right? And so we are deserving of all of the resources in order to scale our work.
Thank you. And Stacy?
So I think that there's collective community here, that this is a transformation is going to happen, you know, incrementally, and that just having access to this information, being able to assess and look at it and make the determination whether or not this is the right time, this is the moment, or if federal funding is going to come down, the pike later when you have other kinds of readiness or support in place. But staying together, knowing that we're in this together, we're not alone in kind of the struggle and the challenge, but that it is surmountable, and really hopeful.
Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for spending this hour with us, sharing your insights and your wisdom. I learned a lot personally, and I'm excited to see all of the work that you all continue to do and the work that all of you on the call today continue to do. And let's not let this be our last conversation. We can definitely keep talking. I dropped our post-event survey in the chat. Feel free to fill that out and let us know what other conversations you'd like us to also have to keep this work going. And I will send out a recording of this webinar as well as some resources, and basically all the resources that were shared in the chat today. I'll include that as well. So thank you all for your time and your energy, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Oh, one last thing. Thank you, Manuel, for providing translation services for this hour. We really appreciate your energy and your work as well. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.